Can you really trust a collection of ancient documents copied and passed down for thousands of years? It's a huge question, and it's one that's filled with some very common and honestly, very understandable doubts. So today, that's what we're going to dive into the evidence behind the Bible's origins and its reliability. Okay, let's just get right to it. Because when you strip away all the layers of academic debate and all the noise, it really just boils down to this one simple question. You just want to know, is this book I'm holding in my hands the real deal? Can I actually trust what I'm reading? And you've probably heard some of these before, right? The idea that there are lost gospels out there that tell a different story, or that the text we have today is like a millennium-long game of telephone gone wrong, or, and this is a big one, that some shadowy council of powerful men just picked the books they liked and threw out the rest. We're going to tackle each of these myths head-on, using some fantastic insights from Dr. John Peckham's research. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to start with that ultimate question of trust. Then we're going to bust 3 of the biggest myths you've likely heard, and we'll wrap it all up with a really fascinating look at what certainty even means when we talk about something like faith. So let's begin right at the heart of the issue itself. How do we even approach a text like this? What kind of evidence should we be looking for when we talk about trust? Let's move from just having doubts to having a more informed confidence. First up, the big one, the one you've probably seen in movies and read in popular novels. It's this idea that powerful church leaders suppressed so-called secret gospels, often called the Gnostic writings, that told a completely different story about Jesus. So what does the actual historical timeline show us? Okay, now look at this timeline because this is absolutely crucial. The New Testament books we have, they were all written in the 1st century, by the people who were there or by their closest friends. But these secret gospels, like the Gospel of Thomas, they don't even start showing up until the middle of the 2nd century. That's a huge time gap. We're talking about multiple generations later. And this is where that personal connection becomes so critical. You had guys like Irenaeus, who had this direct, traceable link right back to the apostles. Think about that for a second. He could literally say, "My teacher Polycarp was personally taught by the apostle John." We know which writings came from the original source. This wasn't some academic guess. It was a living, breathing tradition. And Irenaeus had this brilliant analogy for what was happening. He said the apostolic gospels were like a beautiful, coherent mosaic portrait of a king made from all these precious jewels. But the Gnostics, they were taking the exact same jewels but rearranging them into a distorted picture of a dog or a fox. Same pieces, totally different story. And if you actually read these Gnostic texts, you see exactly what he meant. Take this quote from the Gospel of Thomas. It presents a worldview that is just radically inconsistent with the Jesus of the 4 Gospels we know, the one who constantly valued and elevated women. It's just a completely different theology. Okay, so the books themselves seem to be the authentic early ones, but that leads us straight to the next big concern. Even if the originals were right, hasn't the text been totally corrupted over centuries and centuries of being copied by hand? And that is a totally fair question. I mean, we are talking about thousands of years of manual copying before the printing press even existed. Surely mistakes crept in, right? Well, there's actually a whole science dedicated to answering this called textual criticism, and it gives us a surprisingly clear picture. So scholars have thousands of ancient manuscripts to compare with each other, and when they find differences between them, they call those variants. But here's what they found when they categorized them. The vast majority, we're talking over 70%, are just simple spelling errors. Another huge chunk are just changes in word order that don't even change the meaning in the original Greek language. So here's the bottom line, the number that really matters. After you filter out all the noise, the spelling mistakes, the word order changes, you're left with less than 1% of variants that are both meaningful and viable. That means less than 1% of all differences could possibly change the meaning and have a legitimate claim to being original. It's an incredibly small number. And here is the ultimate takeaway, the real kicker. Even inside that tiny fraction of a percent, not a single one of those variants calls into question any core central teaching of the Christian faith. The main story, the essential message, remains unbelievably consistent. I mean, to put that into perspective, no other ancient text from that period comes even close to this level of textual certainty. It's just remarkable. All right, so we've got the right books, and the text itself is incredibly reliable. But that leads to the next big myth. Who decided which books even made it into the Bible in the first place? The popular idea is that some powerful group of guys just invented the canon, the official list, by picking their favorites and tossing the rest. Well, the history tells a much less conspiratorial story. The key thing to understand here is that the canon wasn't really decided, it was recognized. For the first few centuries, there was no central power to enforce anything. Christians were a scattered, often persecuted minority. And yet, long before any major councils, you see people like Irenaeus, way back in 180 AD, already treating the vast majority of our New Testament books as scripture. The process was organic. It was about the churches recognizing which books they had been using all along and knew came from the apostles. So we've looked at the evidence for the books, and we've looked at the evidence for the text. But this brings us to a final and maybe more philosophical point. After all the evidence is in, what does it really mean to be certain? And where does faith fit into all this? Dr. Peckham brings up what he calls the myth of 100% certainty. It's this very modern idea that we should only believe things that can be proven with the same certainty as a math equation. But think about it for a second. If we actually applied that standard to our everyday lives, we'd be completely paralyzed. It would be impossible to function. I mean, seriously, do you have 100% deductive mathematical proof that the chair you're sitting in right now is going to hold you? Or that the brakes on your car are going to work? Do you have absolute proof that your spouse truly loves you? Of course not. We all operate daily on a foundation of trust that's based on good evidence and reliability. These are everyday acts of faith. And this just completely reframes the entire conversation. It suggests that everybody on the planet operates by faith. The scientist has faith in their own senses and in the scientific method. The skeptic has faith in their own reasoning. So the real question isn't whether you will have faith, it's where you're going to place it. And what's so amazing is that the biblical story itself seems to get this. It doesn't demand perfect, doubt-free belief before you can even start. I mean, the story of the man in Mark chapter 9 is the perfect example. He comes to Jesus, he's full of desperation, he's got uncertainty, and he says, "I believe, but help my unbelief." And Jesus doesn't turn him away. He doesn't say, "Come back when you're 100% sure." He meets him right there in the middle of his doubt. So that really leaves us with a final thought. What if the journey doesn't start with having all the answers? What if the most honest, authentic starting point for any of us isn't claiming 100% certainty, but just saying, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief"?